In a quiet neighborhood on Seymour Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio, there was nothing that suggested horror lived behind the front door of number 2207. The houses stood close together. Children rode bicycles down the street. Neighbors waved as they passed each other on the sidewalk. It was the kind of place where people believed they knew what was happening around them, and that belief would become part of the tragedy. For more than 10 years, 3 women were held captive inside that house. They were beaten, chained, raped, and isolated from the world. While life outside continued as normal, time inside that home stood still. It began in April of 2002, when 16-year-old Amanda Berry disappeared after finishing her shift at a fast food restaurant. She never made it home. Her face appeared on local news broadcasts, her family pleading for answers. Search parties formed, police investigated, and then, slowly, the attention faded. Leads dried up. Amanda Berry became another missing girl in a city already struggling with violence and poverty. 1 year later, in 2003, 14-year-old Gina DeJesus vanished while walking home from school. Her disappearance echoed the same pattern: a young girl, a short walk, a sudden absence. Her family searched relentlessly, posting flyers, speaking to the media, refusing to let her name disappear. But once again, time passed without resolution. In 2004, Michelle Knight went missing. She was 21 years old. Her life had already been marked by hardship, abuse, instability, and poverty. Unlike the other 2 girls, Michelle did not receive widespread media attention. There were no billboards, no national headlines. To many, she simply slipped through the cracks. What no one realized was that all 3 women were alive, and all 3 were being held inside the same house. The man responsible did not look like a monster. Ariel Castro was a school bus driver. He had children of his own. He played guitar. He was known in the neighborhood. He blended in, and that was the most dangerous thing about him. Castro understood how to appear ordinary, trustworthy, harmless. He knew who to target: young girls who could be lured with kindness, promises of help, or a simple ride home. Inside his house, Castro created a private prison. Windows were blocked, doors were reinforced, women were chained to walls and floors. They were denied freedom, denied privacy, denied even the comfort of knowing whether the others were still alive. Castro kept them separated, controlling when they could speak, when they could eat, when they could move. Isolation was not just a condition of captivity, it was a weapon. Years passed. Seasons changed outside, but inside the house, time lost meaning. Birthdays came and went. Holidays passed unnoticed. News broadcasts played in the background, sometimes mentioning the missing girls by name. The women listened as reporters referred to them as cold cases. They heard the world slowly give up. For Amanda Berry, captivity took on another layer of horror when she became pregnant. Castro was the father. He forced her to carry the child to term. When the baby was born, Castro assisted with the delivery himself. The child would spend the first years of her life inside that house, never stepping outside, never knowing freedom. Amanda was forced to become both prisoner and protector, shielding her daughter from the same abuse she endured. Michelle Knight suffered repeated miscarriages after brutal beatings. Her body and spirit were pushed to the edge of survival, yet she endured. Gina DeJesus endured. Survival became an act of defiance, even when hope felt impossible. The captivity lasted more than a decade. And then, on the 6th of May 2013, a mistake changed everything. Castro left the house, but failed to secure one of the doors completely. Amanda Berry heard unfamiliar sounds. She saw a sliver of light where there had always been darkness. For the first time in 10 years, there was an opening. She acted without hesitation, screaming for help, pounding on the door with everything she had left. A neighbor heard her. Police were called. When officers arrived and forced entry, they found what no one had imagined: 3 women. Alive, traumatized, but alive. The revelation shocked Cleveland. It shocked the nation. A man who had lived among them, who had exchanged greetings and smiles, had been hiding unimaginable cruelty behind closed doors. Castro was arrested and charged with hundreds of counts, including kidnapping, rape, and murder-related charges tied to the forced miscarriages. He eventually accepted a plea deal that sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 1,000 years. The sentence ensured he would never walk free again. 1 month into his incarceration, Ariel Castro was found dead in his prison cell. He had taken his own life. There was no apology, no explanation, no closure. The women survived, but survival came at a cost that could not be measured in years or sentences. Freedom did not erase the trauma. It did not undo the lost time, the stolen youth, or the scars that would never fully heal. The house on Seymour Avenue was demolished. The space where the horror unfolded was erased from the landscape. But the questions remain. How could something so horrific exist in plain sight? How many signs were missed? And how many people choose not to look too closely when something feels wrong, simply because it is easier to believe that evil always announces itself? Sometimes it doesn't. For years, people in Cleveland complained about the smell. It drifted through the streets of the Mount Pleasant neighborhood, seeping into nearby homes, lingering in the air. Neighbors described it as unbearable, rotting, sour, unmistakably wrong. Some assumed it came from abandoned houses. Others blamed garbage, dead animals, or the aging infrastructure of a struggling area. The complaints were logged. Officers responded. But nothing was done that would stop what was happening. The smell was death. At the center of it all was a modest brick house on Imperial Avenue, owned by a man named Anthony Sowell. From the outside, it looked no different than the others on the block. Inside, it was one of the most horrific crime scenes Ohio had ever seen. Sowell was a former U.S. Marine. He had a criminal history that included rape, yet after serving time, he returned to Cleveland largely unnoticed. He lived alone, unemployed for long stretches, drifting through the city's margins. To many, he was invisible, and that invisibility gave him power. Between 2007 and 2009, women began to disappear from Cleveland's east side. Most were poor, many struggled with addiction, some were involved in sex work. They were women society often failed to protect, and Sowell knew that. He targeted those least likely to be reported missing immediately, least likely to be searched for aggressively, least likely to be believed. Sowell would invite women back to his house, offering drugs, alcohol, or a place to rest. Once inside, the illusion of safety ended. He restrained them, he raped them, he strangled them, and when they were dead, he hid their bodies sometimes inside his home, sometimes buried in shallow graves nearby, sometimes stuffed into crawl spaces and abandoned buildings. The smell that neighbors complained about came from decomposing bodies stored just feet away from where Sowell slept. Police interactions with Sowell occurred during this time. On more than one occasion, officers were near his property. At one point, a woman escaped from his house and reported being raped. Sowell was questioned but not arrested. The system failed again and again. It wasn't until October 2009 that the truth finally surfaced. Police were searching for a missing woman when they encountered Sowell on the street. He was questioned and arrested on an unrelated warrant. Officers then obtained permission to search his home. The moment they entered, they knew something was terribly wrong. The odor was overwhelming. Inside the house, they found human remains, bones, skulls, decomposing bodies hidden in various stages of concealment. As the investigation expanded, the scale of the crimes became clear. 11 women were confirmed victims. Their remains were found not only inside Sowell's home, but also in nearby vacant lots and abandoned buildings. The neighborhood itself had become part of the crime scene. Families were notified. Many had waited years for answers. Some had been told their loved ones were probably gone by choice. Others had never stopped searching. Now they were faced with a truth more brutal than uncertainty. The city of Cleveland was forced to confront uncomfortable questions. How could a man with a prior rape conviction move freely through vulnerable communities without monitoring? How could repeated complaints about a horrific smell be dismissed? How could women report abuse and still be ignored? Sowell was charged with hundreds of counts, including multiple counts of aggravated murder. The trial revealed the full extent of his brutality. Survivors testified. Families spoke of daughters, sisters, and mothers who never came home. The jury listened as prosecutors laid out years of violence hidden behind a single front door. In 2011, Anthony Sowell was sentenced to death. The courtroom was silent as the sentence was read. For the families, it was justice, but it was not closure. Nothing could undo what had been done. Nothing could return the lives that had been taken or the years lost to unanswered questions. The house on Imperial Avenue was demolished. The vacant lots were cleared. The physical evidence was erased from the streets, but the memory remains, not just of Sowell's crimes, but of the failures that allowed them to continue for so long. The Cleveland Strangler did not operate in secrecy. He operated in plain sight, protected by indifference, systemic neglect, and the assumption that some lives mattered less than others. And that realization lingers long after the case is closed. Before the name Jeffrey Dahmer became synonymous with horror, before the headlines, the courtroom sketches, and the documentaries, there was a single night in Ohio that quietly set everything in motion. In 1978, Dahmer was 18 years old and living in the suburbs of Bath Township near Akron. His parents' marriage was collapsing, and the house where he lived had become empty in every sense. His mother had moved out. His father was often away. The silence inside the home mirrored the isolation growing inside him. That summer, Dahmer's thoughts were already dark. He struggled with alcoholism, social isolation, and violent fantasies he did not understand and could not control. There was no criminal record that would have raised alarms, no diagnosis, no intervention. To the outside world, he was just another troubled teenager drifting after high school. On the 18th of June 1978, Dahmer encountered a young man named Stephen Hicks. Hicks was hitchhiking to a concert. Dahmer offered him a ride and invited him back to the house to drink beer. It was a casual decision, a moment that could have ended differently if either of them had chosen another path. Inside the house, the atmosphere changed. When Hicks decided it was time to leave, Dahmer panicked. He did not want to be alone again. That fear, raw, desperate, and overwhelming, triggered something irreversible. Dahmer struck Hicks with a barbell. When Hicks did not immediately die, Dahmer strangled him. The murder was not impulsive chaos. It was the first time Dahmer acted on the thoughts that had been forming for years, and instead of stopping him, it unlocked something. Over the next several days, Dahmer dismembered Hicks' body in the basement. He dissolved flesh with acid. He crushed bones with a sledgehammer. He scattered the remains in the woods behind the house. The crime went undetected. No neighbors noticed. No police were called. No one came looking. Stephen Hicks became the first victim in what would later be recognized as one of the most notorious killing sprees in American history. What makes this moment especially chilling is how easily it passed without consequence. Dahmer was stopped by police shortly afterward for drunk driving, but the murder was never discovered. There was no investigation, no suspicion. He was allowed to continue his life, carrying the secret with him. In the years that followed, Dahmer's behavior escalated. He joined the army, where his drinking worsened. He was discharged. He drifted between jobs and cities. And eventually, he began killing again, this time with increasing frequency, brutality, and confidence. Looking back, investigators would later identify the Ohio murder as the clear starting point, the moment when the line was crossed, the moment when fantasy became action, and action went unpunished. There were opportunities to intervene, warning signs that, in hindsight, seem unmistakable, but at the time they were overlooked or misunderstood. Dahmer was young, quiet, non-threatening, and so he was allowed to move forward, unchecked. Stephen Hicks' family would not learn the truth until more than a decade later, when Dahmer was finally arrested in Wisconsin and confessed to 17 murders. Only then did the first victim, the one who disappeared in Ohio, emerge from the shadows of the story. By then, the damage was beyond measure. The first murder did not shock the state. It did not make headlines. It did not change laws or trigger reforms. That would come later, after many more lives were lost. But this was the moment everything began. A quiet house, an empty street, a decision made in fear and loneliness that would echo across the nation for years to come. And it all started in Ohio. On the night of the 31st of March 2006, Brian Schaefer stepped into a crowded bar near the campus of Ohio State University and was never seen again. Brian was a 27-year-old medical student, weeks away from graduating. He was intelligent, ambitious, and by all outward appearances, on the verge of a successful future. But beneath that surface, he was carrying quiet grief. Only weeks earlier, his mother had died after a long illness. Those close to him later said he was struggling more than he let on. That Friday night, Brian went out drinking with friends in Columbus. It was meant to be a brief escape, music, alcohol, laughter. They ended up at the Ugly Tuna Saloona, a popular bar located on the second floor of a building that was packed with people celebrating the start of spring. Security cameras recorded Brian entering the bar shortly before midnight. The footage shows him laughing, talking, blending into the crowd. But what the cameras never captured was Brian leaving. At closing time, his friends realized he was gone. They assumed he had left with someone else or stepped outside. His phone went unanswered. By morning, concern turned into panic. Police reviewed hours of surveillance footage. Every entrance and exit from the bar was examined. People were seen leaving in groups, alone, drunk, sober. Brian Schaefer never appeared on any camera again. It was as if he had vanished inside the building. Investigators considered every possibility. Had Brian slipped out through an unmonitored exit? Had he been carried out unnoticed? Had he left under someone else's name or identity? The answers never came. There were no signs of a struggle, no suspicious financial activity. His credit cards were never used. His phone never pinged again. His apartment showed no evidence that he planned to disappear. Everything he owned was left behind. As days turned into weeks, the case gained national attention. The idea that someone could vanish from a crowded bar without a trace unsettled people far beyond Ohio. Theories multiplied. Some believed Brian had chosen to disappear, overwhelmed by grief and pressure. Others suspected foul play, possibly involving someone he met that night. Some wondered if an accident had occurred, hidden by chance and timing. Years passed, leads dried up, witness memories faded. Brian's father, determined to find answers, continued searching until tragedy struck again. In 2008, he died in an accident, never knowing what happened to his son. The Ugly Tuna Saloon eventually closed. The building was renovated. The physical location of Brian's last known moments no longer exists in the same form, but the mystery remains intact. Brian Schaefer is still missing. No body, no confirmed sightings, no definitive explanation. In a world saturated with cameras, records, and digital footprints, his disappearance stands as a reminder that some mysteries resist technology, logic, and time. Sometimes, people do not leave clues behind. Sometimes, they simply vanish. In October 2007, in a quiet suburban home outside Cleveland, a family argument turned fatal over something that, on the surface, seemed trivial: a video game, a rule, a punishment. But beneath it was a growing fracture that no one fully understood until it was too late. Daniel Petrick was 16 years old. He was intelligent, introverted, and intensely focused on video games, particularly Halo 3. After undergoing surgery for a serious infection near his eye, Daniel was prescribed pain medication. Around the same time, his parents noticed a dramatic change in his behavior. He became withdrawn, irritable, and increasingly obsessed with gaming. When his parents discovered that Daniel had been playing Halo despite being told not to, they confiscated the game and locked it in a safe. To them, it was a standard act of discipline. To Daniel, it felt like something far more severe. According to later testimony, he viewed the punishment as the end of the only thing that gave him comfort and control. On October 20, Daniel retrieved his father's handgun from a locked safe. He concealed it beneath his clothing and walked into the family living room, where his parents were sitting together on the couch. He later claimed that he believed the gun was unloaded. Standing behind them, Daniel raised the weapon and pulled the trigger. The bullet struck his mother in the head, killing her instantly. His father was shot next, sustaining severe injuries but surviving. Daniel then placed the gun back where he had taken it from and calmly returned to his room. When police arrived, Daniel initially denied involvement, but evidence quickly contradicted his account. The truth emerged, piece by piece, in a way that left investigators stunned by both the simplicity and the brutality of the act. During questioning, Daniel told police that he had planned the shooting. He had even rehearsed what he would say afterward. He admitted that the loss of the video game had triggered intense anger, but prosecutors emphasized that the motive went beyond frustration. This was not a sudden impulse, it was a calculated decision made by a teenager who had quietly crossed a line. At trial, the defense argued that Daniel's mental state had been compromised by medication and emotional immaturity. The prosecution countered that his actions demonstrated clear intent and awareness. The jury agreed with the prosecution. Daniel Petrick was convicted of aggravated murder and attempted murder. Because he was a minor at the time of the crime, the sentencing reflected a balance between punishment and the possibility, however remote, of rehabilitation. He received a sentence that would keep him incarcerated well into adulthood. The case ignited a national conversation about violent video games, mental health, parental discipline, and the warning signs that are often dismissed until after tragedy strikes. But for the surviving family members, those debates offered little comfort. A mother was gone, a father was permanently changed, and a teenager's life was defined forever by a moment that could never be undone. The Petrick case remains one of Ohio's most unsettling examples of how violence can erupt not from chaos, but from silence when resentment grows unchecked, and no one realizes how far someone is willing to go until it happens. In the early morning hours of the 2nd of June 2013, a quiet home in the small Ohio town of Montville became the site of a crime that would shatter an entire community. Inside, a family lay dead. Outside, nothing seemed out of place. The grass was still wet with morning dew, the road was empty, and the man responsible was already gone. George Brinkman was a father of two, a man who had once lived an ordinary life. He had been married, held jobs, and raised children. But by the time that morning arrived, his life had unraveled. Financial trouble, marital breakdown, and mounting anger had pushed him toward a breaking point that no one around him fully recognized. That night, Brinkman entered the home where his estranged wife and two young sons were staying. What happened next was swift and merciless. He shot his wife, killing her. He then turned the gun on his children, ages 9 and 11, ending their lives as well. The violence was deliberate. There was no sign of hesitation. When the bodies were discovered, the house was silent. Brinkman had fled the scene, leaving behind devastation and unanswered questions. Almost immediately, law enforcement agencies across Ohio and neighboring states launched a massive manhunt. Brinkman was considered armed, dangerous, and capable of further violence. For days, he evaded capture. He traveled across state lines, stealing vehicles, breaking into homes, and narrowly avoiding police. Each passing hour intensified the fear that he would kill again. Communities were warned to stay inside. Schools increased security. The case dominated headlines. Investigators pieced together Brinkman's movements, tracing a trail of stolen cars and surveillance footage. They learned that he had been growing increasingly unstable in the months leading up to the murders. His marriage had collapsed, he was struggling financially. Friends later described him as angry, withdrawn, and obsessed with perceived betrayals. The manhunt ended several days later in Pennsylvania, when police located Brinkman inside a truck. Surrounded and with no escape, he turned the gun on himself, ending his life before officers could take him into custody. With his death came a grim finality. There would be no trial, no interrogation, no opportunity to hear, in his own words, why he chose to destroy his family. The motive, while partially reconstructed through evidence and witness accounts, would never be fully explained. The town of Montville mourned together. Vigils were held. Names were spoken aloud in candlelight. People struggled to understand how a father could become the instrument of such complete destruction. There were no easy answers, only grief, disbelief, and the lingering sense that something had been missed. The Brinkman family murders stand as one of Ohio's most haunting reminders that danger does not always come from strangers. Sometimes, it grows quietly within the walls of a family, hidden behind everyday routines, until it erupts with irreversible consequences. On a summer evening in July 2016, 19-year-old Sierra Joffin went out for a bike ride along a quiet rural road in Fulton County, Ohio. It was a route she had taken many times before: flat farmland, long stretches of isolation, and the kind of calm that made danger feel distant. She never made it home. When Sierra failed to return, her family knew something was wrong. The search began almost immediately, drawing in local law enforcement, volunteers, and neighbors. What made this case different from so many others in rural America was not just the urgency, but the trail of digital evidence that followed. Within days, investigators identified James Worley, a man living near the road where Sierra was last seen. He was known to residents as a quiet, reclusive figure, someone who kept to himself. But beneath that exterior was a history of violent sexual behavior that had gone largely unnoticed by the public. Surveillance footage from nearby homes showed a man following Sierra in a pickup truck as she rode her bicycle. Cell phone data placed Worley in the area at the exact time of her disappearance. Tire tracks matched his vehicle. Each piece alone was circumstantial. Together, they formed a tightening net. Police obtained a search warrant for Worley's property. What they found confirmed their worst fears. Sierra's bicycle was discovered hidden nearby. Her DNA was later recovered from Worley's truck and belongings. The evidence told a chilling story of abduction, restraint, and murder. Investigators learned that Worley had forcibly taken Sierra from the roadside, transported her to a barn on his property, and sexually assaulted her before killing her. Her body was later found in a nearby field, discarded as though her life had meant nothing. The speed at which the case was solved stood in stark contrast to many rural murders. Technology played a crucial role: home security cameras, cell phone location data, digital timelines. This was not the kind of crime that disappeared into the countryside unnoticed. Every movement left a trace. At trial, prosecutors laid out the evidence with clinical precision. The jury heard about Worley's prior conviction for a violent sexual offense, a history that underscored the danger he posed long before Sierra ever crossed his path. The defense attempted to cast doubt, but the digital and physical evidence was overwhelming. James Worley was convicted of aggravated murder, kidnapping, and rape. He was sentenced to death. For Sierra's family, the conviction brought a measure of justice, but not peace. They spoke openly about the pain of knowing how much their daughter suffered in her final moments. They also spoke about the importance of awareness, how quickly a routine activity can turn deadly, and how predators often hide in plain sight. The Joffin case left a lasting mark on Ohio. It became a symbol of how modern investigations can succeed when every available tool is used, but also a reminder that technology does not prevent violence, it only helps uncover it afterward. A young woman went out for a bike ride. A man decided she would not come back, and a quiet stretch of rural road became the setting for one of the state's most disturbing crimes. In the late 1970s, Ohio became the center of one of the most controversial criminal cases in American history. A case that forced the justice system to confront a question it was never prepared to answer. What happens when a defendant claims that the person who committed the crime is not the same person standing trial? The man at the center of that question was Billy Milligan. In 1977, a series of rapes occurred near the campus of Ohio State University in Columbus. The victims described a man who abducted them at gunpoint, drove them to secluded locations, and sexually assaulted them. Witness descriptions led police to Milligan, a 23-year-old with a history of arrests for robbery and assault. When Milligan was taken into custody, investigators expected a straightforward case. The evidence was strong. The victims identified him. His fingerprints and physical appearance matched descriptions. But during questioning, something unusual began to emerge. Milligan did not deny that the crimes had occurred. Instead, he claimed he had no memory of committing them. As psychiatrists evaluated him, a startling diagnosis was introduced. According to multiple mental health professionals, Milligan was suffering from what was then known as multiple personality disorder, now called dissociative identity disorder. They concluded that Milligan did not possess a single personality, but many, each with distinct voices, behaviors, and memories. Some of these personalities were children. Others spoke with foreign accents. Some were peaceful. Others were violent. According to the defense, it was not Billy Milligan who committed the rapes, but alternate personalities who took control of his body. The court was faced with an unprecedented situation. Never before had an American defendant successfully argued that multiple personalities rendered him legally innocent of violent crimes. The prosecution insisted that Milligan was manipulating the system, using psychology as a shield. The defense argued that he was profoundly mentally ill and incapable of controlling his actions. Expert testimony filled the courtroom. Psychiatrists debated the legitimacy of the diagnosis. The victims listened, as the man who attacked them was described as fractured, traumatized, and detached from his own crimes. The process was painful, confusing, and deeply unsettling for everyone involved. In the end, the court ruled Milligan not guilty by reason of insanity. Instead of prison, he was committed to a series of state psychiatric hospitals, where he would spend years under treatment. The decision sent shockwaves across Ohio and the nation. Many saw it as a miscarriage of justice. Others viewed it as a necessary acknowledgement of severe mental illness. Public outrage was intense. Victims felt abandoned by a system that appeared to value the mind of the offender over the suffering of those he harmed. Lawmakers questioned whether the insanity defense had gone too far. Mental health professionals found themselves under scrutiny, as their field became the focus of public skepticism. Milligan's time in psychiatric institutions was long and complex. Doctors claimed progress. Personalities allegedly integrated. Years passed. In 1988, after more than a decade in state care, Milligan was released. He never stood trial again for the Ohio rapes. The case left behind no clear resolution, only lasting controversy. It forced a reckoning between law and psychology, responsibility and illness. It raised questions that still have no simple answers. Can a person be both guilty and not guilty at the same time? Where does accountability end when identity itself is fractured? For Ohio, the Billy Milligan case became more than a crime story. It became a symbol of uncertainty, proof that some cases do not end with a verdict that feels complete, and that justice, when filtered through the complexities of the human mind, can leave everyone dissatisfied. On the morning of the 28th of November 2016, the campus of Ohio State University was already awake. Students hurried between buildings. Faculty prepared for lectures. It was the kind of ordinary weekday routine that feels permanent until it isn't. Just before 10 a.m., a car jumped the curb near Watts Hall. It plowed into a group of pedestrians, knocking several people to the ground. At first, witnesses thought it was an accident. Then the driver got out. He was holding a knife. The attacker was Abdul Razak Ali Artan, an 18-year-old student at the university. Within seconds, he began stabbing people at random, chasing victims across the sidewalk as panic erupted around him. Students ran. Some hid. Others froze, unsure of what they were seeing. University police responded almost immediately. An officer confronted Artan less than 2 minutes after the attack began. When Artan continued advancing with the knife, the officer fired, killing him on the scene. By the time it was over, 11 people had been injured. None were killed, but several suffered serious wounds. The speed of the response likely prevented far greater loss of life. As the campus went into lockdown, confusion spread. Rumors flew across social media. Students sheltered in classrooms and dormitories, waiting for updates, refreshing their phones in fear. Helicopters hovered overhead. Sirens echoed through the streets. Investigators quickly began piecing together Artan's background. He was a Somali-born refugee who had come to the United States with his family years earlier. He had enrolled at Ohio State, where classmates later described him as quiet but increasingly angry. In the months before the attack, he had posted messages online, expressing frustration, political grievances, and admiration for extremist violence abroad. The FBI took over the investigation, treating the attack as an act of terrorism inspired by extremist ideology. Officials emphasized that there was no evidence of a larger network or coordinated plan, but the ideological motivation was clear. For Ohio State, the attack cut deep. A place meant for learning and safety had been violated in moments. Students struggled to reconcile the normalcy of campus life with the realization of how quickly it could collapse. Many spoke openly about fear, vulnerability, and the lingering sense that danger no longer felt distant. The incident also reignited national debates about campus security, radicalization, immigration, and how warning signs are identified and addressed. But for those who were there that morning, the larger arguments faded behind more immediate memories. The sound of screaming, the sight of blood on concrete, the chaos of running without knowing where safety was. Artan's death ended the attack, but it did not end its impact. For the victims, recovery was physical and psychological. For the university, it was a moment that permanently altered its sense of security. And for Ohio, it was another reminder that violence does not always arrive with warning. It can erupt in the middle of an ordinary day. In the early morning hours of the 13th of June 2009, the quiet Ohio town of Stowe woke to a crime so devastating that it fractured the idea of safety inside the American family home. By the time the sun rose, 4 people were dead, and the man responsible was driving calmly toward a police station to turn himself in. His name was John Hummel. To the outside world, Hummel appeared unremarkable. He was a husband, a father, a man with a steady job. Neighbors described him as polite, reserved, and largely invisible. There were no public signs of volatility, no loud arguments spilling into the street, no police calls that hinted at what was coming. If anything, Hummel blended perfectly into the background of suburban life. Behind closed doors, however, his world was collapsing. Hummel was drowning in debt. Years of financial mismanagement had piled into a mountain he could no longer climb. Credit cards were maxed out, bills went unpaid, Foreclosure loomed. What made the situation unbearable was not just the money itself, but the lie he had built around it. Hummel had hidden the truth from his wife, Donna, for years. He forged documents. He intercepted mail. He maintained the illusion that everything was under control. But lies have a way of surfacing. As pressure mounted, Hummel became increasingly withdrawn. He spent long hours alone, obsessing over his finances, replaying conversations in his head, imagining the moment when everything would be exposed. In his mind, disclosure was not just humiliation, it was annihilation. He believed his family would be destroyed by shame, by loss, by the knowledge that he had failed them. Rather than face that reckoning, Hummel chose another path. In the early hours of that Saturday morning, while his family slept, Hummel retrieved a handgun. He moved through the house deliberately, methodically, without panic. First, he went to his wife's bedroom. Donna never woke up. He shot her as she slept. Then he turned the gun on his children. His teenage daughter, his young son, each was killed in their beds. There was no struggle, no warning, no chance to run. After the house fell silent, Hummel did not flee. He did not attempt to hide what he had done. Instead, he gathered his thoughts, got into his car, and drove to the local police station. When he arrived, he told officers exactly what he had done. He was calm, cooperative, emotionally flat. Officers initially struggled to comprehend his confession, but when police went to the home, they found the truth waiting inside. 4 bodies, a family erased in a single night. The town of Stowe was stunned. Friends, neighbors, co-workers all asked the same question. How could a man who seemed so ordinary commit such an act? How could financial stress, something so common, lead to such absolute destruction? As investigators dug deeper, the picture became clearer and more disturbing. Hummel had been living under the weight of his secrets for years. He believed that exposure would cost him his marriage, his reputation, and his identity. In his fractured thinking, killing his family was an act of protection, an attempt to spare them from shame and suffering. It was a logic so warped that it chilled even seasoned investigators. At trial, prosecutors painted a portrait of premeditation and control. This was not a moment of rage. It was a calculated decision made over time. Hummel had planned the murders. He had chosen the timing. He had ensured that no one could intervene. The defense argued that Hummel was mentally overwhelmed, crushed by stress and fear, incapable of rational thought. But the jury was not convinced. His actions after the murders, his calm demeanor, his decision to turn himself in demonstrated awareness and intent. John Hummel was convicted of aggravated murder. He received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. In court, family members spoke through tears. They described Donna as a loving mother, a devoted wife, a woman who trusted her husband completely. They spoke of children whose lives ended before they truly began. The courtroom listened as the full weight of the loss settled into the room. Yet even after the verdict, the questions did not fade. The Hummel case forced Ohio and the nation to confront uncomfortable realities. Financial stress is common, fear of failure is widespread, but the idea that a man could convince himself that murdering his family was an act of mercy exposed the terrifying extremes of human rationalization. Psychologists later described Hummel's mindset as a form of catastrophic thinking. In his mind, there were only 2 futures, total disgrace or total annihilation. And he chose annihilation. The home where the murders occurred was eventually sold. New people moved in. The walls were repainted, the carpets replaced. On the surface, life continued. But for the community, something fundamental had shifted. Parents hugged their children tighter. Couples talked for the first time about debt, fear, and pressure. The case became a quiet warning whispered beneath everyday conversations. Secrecy can be lethal, and silence can be dangerous. John Hummel did not fit the stereotype of a killer. He did not snap in public. He did not threaten violence. He did not ask for help, and that may be the most unsettling part of all, because the danger did not come from chaos. It came from control. It came from a man who believed that maintaining an image was more important than telling the truth, and who chose to destroy everything rather than admit he was failing. The Hummel familicide remains one of Ohio's most haunting cases, not because it was loud or chaotic, but because it was quiet, calculated, and rooted in a fear that many people recognize, but few are willing to confront. And in that silence, an entire family disappeared. When the last siren fades and the final courtroom door closes, what remains is not just a list of crimes, but a pattern that refuses to be ignored. Ohio did not become infamous because of one killer, one family, or one night of violence. It became a mirror reflecting how ordinary places can hide extraordinary darkness, and how easily that darkness can be overlooked when it wears familiar faces. These cases unfolded in neighborhoods, on college campuses, along rural roads, and inside homes meant to be safe. They did not begin with chaos. They began with silence, with secrets, with warning signs that seemed too small, too uncomfortable, or too easy to explain away. A man who looked like a neighbor held women captive for more than a decade. A serial killer operated openly while complaints were dismissed. A future doctor vanished in a room full of people. A teenager turned discipline into bloodshed. A father decided his family was better off dead than exposed. A predator followed a cyclist down a country road. A student turned a campus into a crime scene. And a courtroom was forced to ask whether a fractured mind could escape responsibility altogether. Each case ended differently, some with convictions, some with death, some with no answers at all. But together, they leave behind the same question. How close does violence live to us? The truth is uncomfortable. Evil does not always announce itself. It does not always look angry, broken, or threatening. Sometimes it looks employed. Sometimes it looks polite. Sometimes it looks like someone just trying to hold their life together. And sometimes, the most disturbing realization is not what these people did, but how long it took for anyone to stop them. Ohio's stories remind us that justice is often reactive, not preventative. That systems fail quietly before they fail loudly. That the people most at risk are often the least protected. And that by the time the truth is undeniable, the cost has already been paid in lives. These cases are closed on paper, but their echoes remain in families who will never be whole again, in communities that learned too late, and in unanswered questions that linger long after the headlines disappear. Because the real horror is not that these crimes happened, it's that they happened while life went on around them. And somewhere, in some quiet place, the next warning sign may already be there waiting to be noticed or ignored.